This is Block 3, Lecture 5, The Importance of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening kind of served two purposes. One, it invented American Christianity, or it kind of brought into being American Christianity, and it's also politically set the stage for the American Revolution. You can go through your notes and you'll find that the Great Awakening started in the, about 1719, 1720. It didn't really have one moment where it started. It sort of developed, organically through in many of the colonies. This different style of preaching, this kind of revival style of preaching that some of you might be familiar with, and the message of the preaching was a little bit different. And it's not started in the cities. It's not started in established population areas with established churches. It's, like I said, started by, preachers going from town to town, village to village, frontier area to frontier area, spreading this new message. And what was the new message? The new message was kind of codified by Jonathan Edwards, who was a Puritan preacher. He was from Massachusetts. And he could preach a fire and brimstone sermon with the best of them. But, the more he preached fire and brimstone, and the more he kind of, looked into himself, he kind of changed his view on how people should approach God. And Edwards started to say that, look, God's anger is real, and God gets angry, and God will punish sinners, but we should be focusing on different things. And he said that we should focus on God's gifts, God's bounties, the wonderful, beautiful things that God has given us. And we should focus on the fact that God tries to get himself into the souls of men. And happiness is found in this world by seeking God and God's truth. And God, said Jonathan Edwards, wishes to be found. God wants you to find him, Edwards said. And anyone can do it, that you don't have to be an elect. And then he proceeds to demolish the Puritan concept of predestination that we've talked about, a lot, that Edwards said, look, there is no predestination, that every individual person can be good because they can recognize good. They can act good because they can recognize good. And how can they recognize good? By accepting God. And if you accept God, you can recognize what is good. If you recognize what is good, you can act good. And that kind of takes that concept of predestination and puts it on the back burner. And predestination and the idea that there was an elect and some people, were destined for hell and some people were destined for heaven kind of leaves American culture never to return at that point. Aspects of it remain, cultural aspects. We believe that God smiles down on people if they're successful and, wealthy and things like that. But Edwards' new convictions say that free will, good works, purity of conduct, appreciation of the natural beauty of the world, enjoyment of the beauties of the world, that's an important one, that you're supposed to enjoy life and enjoy the beauty of God's creation. That's a much different set of beliefs than traditional Puritanism. And if you do those things, God will see you through to salvation. And those beliefs start to, as they move through the colonies, and they did quickly, and people were talking, and people were going to these camp revival meetings, it becomes this frontier religion available for all people, that this was something that everyone could catch on to, everyone could appreciate. And it started to define this American Christianity. And I want to define American Christianity a couple different ways. American Christianity from that point forward to this day has kind of been marked by evangelical vigor. The idea that emotion and a feeling of closeness to God was very important. And evangelicalism has played a huge role in American religious history. White churches, black churches, this evangelical spirit is much more prevalent in the United States than it is in other Christian countries, especially in Europe. American religion tends to downplay the clergy, that priests were, could be local community leaders and people that were looked up to on a local level, but priests in the United States would never gain any sense of national importance on a macro level, that the clergy was not important. If you were a lay leader in your church, then you were just as influential sometimes as the clergyman. there was little stress on liturgical correctness. This is the way the prayers are supposed to be, and that's final was very important in Europe, and it's just not that important ever in the United States. Less importance on parish boundaries. Boundaries between, this bishopric and that bishopric played a huge role in European politics for hundreds of years, never in the United States. And the most important part of this American Christianity was its emphasis on individual experience. Your relationship with God, your feeling the Holy Spirit, whatever it is you want to call it, but the idea that the individual could have a personal relationship with God, it's a throwback to, the Christianity of Jesus, or the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, of course, wasn't Christian. But this idea that every person, every single person, every individual farmer in the back country, in the backwoods, could have this experience with God is an important part of American culture. And really kind of what set this Great Awakening off in a lot of ways was a line from Revelations, "Behold, I shall make all things new." And America was a place where all things were becoming new, that people could own land, people had the frontier, people could make a lot of money, that there was nothing holding you back in America, it seemed, for a lot of people. And this idea that the world was becoming new again, that the world was improving, that that religion was improving, politics were improving, people were improving, starts to pervade American religion. That the world that we can perfect our communities, that we can perfect ourselves through God's grace, through good works, is a very American idea. And it's going to pervade American culture for a very, very long time. So American religion is undogmatic. It doesn't really care much for what's the Lutheran view of transubstantiation versus the Calvinist view of transubstantiation. I would go out on a limb and say that most Lutherans and most Calvinists couldn't even tell you the difference. That the dogma doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're a decent person in America, in American religion, regardless really of what denomination you happen to be. American religion is moralistic, not creedal, meaning that the creed doesn't matter. Whether you are a Lutheran or a Calvinist or a Presbyterian matters much less in America than it ever mattered in Europe. What is important is the morals that you show in your day-to-day life. American religion is tolerant but strong. You drive through, New England towns today, back then, and, there's Lutheran church, and next door is the Calvinist church, and down the block is the Catholic church, and Americans, had much fewer issues with religion than Europeans did. We, from the beginning, in general, were kind of a live and let live kind of person, with a couple notable exceptions, but by and large, the religious violence that racked Europe for a long time was never present in America. And this idea of religion becomes all pervasive in society. Since it's accessible to everybody, everybody participates, and woe betide to you who didn't participate. There was a lot less tolerance for people who participated in no church than people who participated in a different church. And that kind of pervades American culture as well. That's its religious sense. But the Great Awakening also had this political component as well. Until the Great Awakening, the colonies were more directly tied to London than to each other. That there was a line from Boston to London, from New York to London, from Charleston to London, from Williamsburg to London. The Great Awakening is an American phenomenon, and it links the colonies to each other. That when Jonathan Edwards died, he was talked about in obituaries in all the papers in America, from New Hampshire to Georgia, and that starts to create this sense of there's an American as opposed to Englishmen transplanted across the ocean. American celebrities were created, Jonathan Edwards being the first real American celebrity. He was known wherever he went, drew huge crowds. 10,000 people at a time would come to listen to Jonathan Edwards preach. The message of the Great Awakening, that all things were becoming new again, kind of gave the sense that great events were unfolding and that people could take part in them. It was rationalism plus popular enthusiasm. And the Great Awakening had both rational statements, rational beliefs, religion done in a rational way, and this just great popular emotion. It mixed the two. That, for the leaders, if you will, the elites, it was rational, and for the regular people, it was a damn good flying time. and that was a potent mixture politically. All the old preachers, those old Puritan preachers, the old Anglican preachers, the people who were, go to church, it was the same for 30 years, 50 years, now it's new. It's this rejection of authority in a lot of ways. The authority of the old line Puritans was reduced. The authority of the Anglicans in the South was reduced, replaced by this democratic idea that every individual person had a part to play with God. And at first, the anti-authority statement is directed at the preachers, and soon enough that anti-authority statement, with the belief that everyone is unique and special and has a role to play in the world to come, that feeling that starts religiously is going to soon turn itself and aim itself directly at the mother country, England. That without the Great Awakening, without this anti-authority belief, that without this idea that the world is being remade, without this idea that every individual person has a role to play, the American Revolution could not ever have happened. Paul Johnson, whose book I like, and you've read out of Paul Johnson, you will read more, pretty much calls the American Revolution at its core a religious event. An event that fulfilled God's plan to make the world new again through the actions of free people responsible to themselves and responsible to God. The French Revolution, on the other hand, is anti-religious. They tear down the churches, they kill the priests, but the American Revolution uses religion in support of political liberty. And that is one of the unique things about the American Revolution. Its basis in this Great Awakening, its basis in this religious revival.